surrounded by the green environments of Victoria, the flowers, but flowers on stage. I think this is a first for Kolkata Literary Meet, and thank you so much for doing this. The first session is Pushpa Aradhana, the fragrant journey of flowers through India's history. Amita Prasad and Priyadarshini Guha in conversation with Johar Sarkar. Quick introductions. Amita Prasad found her passion in school teaching. She is co-author of several books on history and civic series. She is at present director, Indus Valley World School. Priyadarshini Guha is presently the Dean of Arts at Indus Valley World School. She's not only multi-talented, her interests span across aspects, and she's a regular at Kolkata Literary Meet. Johar Sarkar is a retired Indian civil servant who was CEO Prasar Bharati from 2012 to 2016, and we are fortunate that he's also one of our Kalam regulars. May I please have all of you up on stage? Amita ma'am, Priyadarshini, Johar sir.
Good morning. I'll have to take a picture of this gathering because my wife swore that nobody's going to come to listen to you, an old man. I said, anyway, I got to take a picture. Now, it takes a lot of convincing at home, no? Now, where is Kavita di? Kavita di, आप आइए एक बार. Huh? हाँ, where is he? Milan?
And we'll request Nilayan to please join us on stage. The idea is this. This book has not been launched anywhere yet. The official launch is going to be in Jaipur in 2020, at the end of the month of February. But Malavika Banerjee, who's in absentia at the moment, we're expecting her to join us. That's the director of the Kolkata Literary Meet. She said that considering all of you are Calcutta people, why aren't we having a launch in Kolkata? So she very kindly said that we should have a launch in Calcutta. So the book is being opened at the Kolkata Literary Meet 2020 in your presence. And thank you all of you for making it possible.
Say something. Okay, so we start with this book. The first comment is that it's a bit heavy, and one could use it for morning exercises as well. But it isn't heavy in the sense of being intimidating. Nor is it one of those, spend your time, look at coffee table books. I agreed to it because there's a lot of thought and love that's got into this book. This book is basically made under the inspiration of Kavita Poddar by these two young ladies on two sides, Amita and Priyadarshini. But the photographs, now where's that guy gone?
He's there.
He's been outstanding.
The over 90% of the photographs in the book are clicked by Nilayan Chatterjee.
Okay.
And it wouldn't have really been possible
Melancholy.
without this boy who is a student, but he gave of himself so selflessly to make this book possible.
Okay, now, whatever I have gathered of the idea of the book, it's a production on behalf of WAFA India, that's World Association of Flower Arrangers. They have a large international organization, and every nation presents its aspect, its. Oh, hi.
So as
Feel
I
at
said,
home.
my friend was in absentia, but she says she got caught in a CISF briefing outside. As you all must have seen what happened in today's newspaper. But I'm glad Mala's here. So we'll continue.
Okay. So this is a tribute by the Indian organization WAFA in collaboration with Pushpa Vitan to place before an international audience. It will be an item that will be discussed and circulated amongst the international community. And therefore, I'm very proud that we have come up with a production that can sort of keep its head high in the international community. But then I would start by asking Amita and Priyadarshini, who will start? Either or. Okay, now you guys start and explain what drove you to it, and I'll chip in with a few themes that have struck me as I went through the book. Just a perspective of looking at it. Let me clarify for those who haven't held this 5 kg book or 10 kg book. It's not all on flowers. So if you think it's on flower arrangement, ikebana or something like that, forget it. It's not that. I mean, they are very beautiful pictures. It's more about flora per se. And that would include flowers, plants, derivatives thereof, what India produces, from, let's say, bamboo, from shola. So that's all there. So it's basically an extension of a few select varieties of flora. Push, of course, relates to flower, but it's much more than flower. So we'll come to that as we roll along. Pradeshi, you start. She's an expert, actually. She has it in the family. So
That you came to know just a little while ago. Never mind. To, put this long story in a nutshell, it's absolutely been a labor of love for my friend and myself. And we were approached by Mrs. Kavita Poddar around August 2018. And she said that we want the both of you to do this book. Now, it's quite astounding, and that's exactly what I told Amita when we were standing at the press, when the first copies were rolling out, how we managed this. I really don't know, because both of us are not really writers. We are teachers. Both of us have been teachers, me for 25 plus years, she for 35 plus years. And the only love that we've known is the love of history and the love of children. And here we were presented with this daunting task by Mrs. Poddar, whom we couldn't say no to. And she said that now it's your baby, and the both of you have to do this. And that's where our journey began. And we managed to go to press as we had decided. And possibly there, what comes into play is that both of us, to a fault, if I may say so, are meticulous planners. We plan everything to the last detail. So we had decided when we took on the project that we would go to press in September 2019. And kudos to the both of us that we kept to it amidst all odds and keeping full-time jobs. Both of us took on new assignments. We changed jobs, but the book happened. And I think the book happened because somewhere along the way, both of us fell in love with this idea of doing this book. Am I right if I say that? And that's where the journey began. And I have to say that both from Mrs. Poddar and my sister, Mrs. Boishakhi Ghosh, we got to see an enormous amount of books that were around in the world on flowers. And the idea that both of us got was that ours is not going to be just another book on flowers. So we had to give it a storyline, and had to give it a structure, which for a while drove us insane. Because on the one hand, we had the task of showcasing the work of these outstanding floral artists. And we were told very clearly that this is going to be the first book of its kind that is going to go out to an international audience. The book is not really meant for an Indian audience. It's going to showcase India to the rest of the world. So keeping that perspective in mind, we had to move. And that's how it began. For a while, I think we knocked our heads against one another and we said, how are we going to structure this? And where it's India, as you know, we have a problem of plenty. Do all of you agree with me on that one? Vis-a-vis everything, we have a problem of plenty, whether it's population, whether it's poverty, whether it's flowers. And then when the first meeting I remember we had with Mrs. Podar, we had a list of something like 37 or 40 items on the list. Because you see, the floral artists had to work in tandem with us. We couldn't work in isolation. So we said if we had to cover, these 40, we had left out maybe 140. But if we had to cover even these 40, it would mean not one book. And Sir has already said it weighs 5 kilos. We had to really think hard. And Mrs. Podar gave us her enormous support where she told us that, let's look at it carefully. Let's keep revisiting the list. And we cut it down finally to 14. And then we came into this point where we said that, it cannot just be flowers. India has so much to showcase to the world. And that's where Mrs. Podar told us, no, don't make it only flowers, because it's flowers and plants and all that surrounds us, because that is incredible India. And we are taking India to the World Forum. So as Sir said very correctly, then we had to choose carefully. And I think I'm going to bring in Amita over here, where she'll talk to us a little bit about how we chose and what made us choose it.
I think when it came to choosing, it was the Pushpabitan team that really comes in here, because they are the ones who selected the material that would lend itself best to their floral art. And what we actually did was contextualize those things. And because we are both essentially history teachers, we had to give it a historical perspective. So what we did was took up those plants which lent themselves to beautiful art and then put it in a historical context and, equally importantly, a cultural context. So we wanted to showcase some of the rituals, for instance, that go with some of these plants. We wanted to talk about some of the myths and legends which are associated with these plants. So that's how each chapter in the book evolved. So we had to include a bit of history, a bit of culture, a bit of myths, a bit of legend, and then something that is typical of India, where we take and we use every little bit of the plant. So whether it's the root or the stem or the leaf or the flower, how each part is used. And of course, once again, being India, food is never far away from our minds. So we also had to include a little bit about how these plants are part of our daily diet.
I'll quickly go through the subjects covered to give you an idea of where we restrict the conversation. It starts with coconut. It doesn't start with a rose. There's a game plan behind it. It moves on from coconut to hibiscus, hibiscus to tulsi, lotus, rose, and tuberose, marigold, that's all, genda. And then it moves on to other products, as I said, shola and bamboo craft, talks about the mango, the banana spices, planting material, floral artist, floral art, pan supari. Now that's very interesting. Basically, I tried to take a little more analytical view of what we have presented. And I find something very fascinating. The two Indias that got together on this subcontinent, and I'm not referring to Bharat and India and all that, I'm referring to two basically different and at times oppositional cultures that formed India. Put it in very, very rough binary, I'll put it like this. Totally generalizing it, I'd put it like this. Of course, there's a big debate about this because the Aryans are supposed to have, some people say that they were born in Gujarat, so they didn't come from outside. And that's to sort of facilitate the NRC debate, that they're not foreigners. Okay, basically you will notice that in India we have a sweep of Indo-European culture, which starts with Sanskrit, which starts with everything, that there's an overload, there's a predominance of cultural symbolisms that come in, that connects us. I won't use the word come in, that connects us with the rest of the world to the West. But what we sort of play down a bit is the influence that India is just an extension of the Indian Ocean, Pacific, and Southeast Asia. That we play down for some reason, because culturally we belong to the broad groups of Caucasian. Now, how we bring it in, I'll explain. There are four of the basic flora of India that are distinct signatures of Asia Pacific. Let's start. The banana. We can't do anything without the banana. The banana is the symbol of vegetation. The banana has to be married off to Ganesh before Durga Puja. The banana is there as an auspicious symbol at the gates. The banana is a mandatory offering to the gods. The banana is a gift from Southeast Asia. The pan and supari, which of course produces terrible byproducts, very colorful ones. But we are not the only one in the world to face this. This is an addiction in Taiwan, and they're having very serious problems in China, Taiwan, Philippines, in Timor, in the Polynesian Islands. So this comes in all the way from there and gets integrated into the Indo-Gangetic plain, where we celebrate the Banarasi pan. The pan and supari tambula as a gift is mentioned all the way in the oldest of our scriptures. A, B. Third is the bamboo. No, it didn't come from Modi's Gujarat. It came in from, no, he uses it, but that's beside the point. He uses it. No, he is a friend. I worked under him. No problem. It came from Southeast Asia. And the last, Southeast Asia, and there are many dishes in the Northeast that are still prepared in bamboo. Okay? And the fourth one, a gift of the Asia Pacific, as I put it, is a coconut. These four integrate us with the Asia Pacific, look east, ASEAN membership, out of which India just walked out. So we have this connection that goes in from the east, and we have a lot of our culture is a contribution from the what we can broadly call the Northeast. I'm very fond of saying, as somebody who dabbled a bit with history and social anthropology, and knew just enough to make a fool of himself, that the integral part of the Mongolian culture in India is not the 7 sisters, not even the 8 sisters. We take Sikkim as the 8th. Huh? It's a 9th sister, East Bengal, that completely absorbed absorb the wave of culture. Right, comes out in various forms. Caucasians use the knife from top to bottom. Okay. The indigenous Indian use it against the knife, cuts the fruit against their boti. So there are these symbols that Iravati Karve had pointed out, that these are the small markers of civilization. Small markers. Which way do you use the knife? Where do you do it? So there are lots of markers, and these are the markers I've picked up. So these four will. This is not a top-down discussion. It's only to stimulate. These four that I've just mentioned: the bamboo, banana, the coconut, and the pan supari. Of these, you'll find that as you move into the interior of India and up to the north, most of these disappear. Most of these disappear because those climes were not suitable for it. And even Banaras, which holds on to one of them, pan, is again imports it, means gets it from other parts of India very heavily. So having said that, we get that. Now, what on earth is Indian then? What on earth is Indian? India has given a lot of gifts of flora to the world, and one of them is a mango. The mango comes from the root word in Tamil, mankai. Sir, is it mankai or mangai? Anyway, K and G to aapke liye
Sir, you
Mangai.
tell us.
mangai. So anyway, K and G are the same for you. So K and G to wo barabar ho jata. No, but it's not only for the Dravidian languages, for us as well. K and G, Ka and Ga are similar. Cow, Gau, we have this even in Indo-Aryan language. So mankai or mangai is India's gift, and in fact the word itself is a Dravidian word. So that there is a lot of legends that go around the mango, and I'll ask Priyadarshini to say a few words on it.
You know, you can take everything out of the both of us, but you can't take the history teacher out of us. That's why every chapter you will see, those of you who would look at the book hereafter, has a section on history. I'm going to just take a few lines out from the mango chapter because Sir's brought in the mango, and I'll share it with you. Okay, I'll do that the next time. For over 3,000 years, mangoes have delighted the senses of people in the subcontinent across all classes and ages with their fragrance and flavor, and consequently influenced myths and folklore. In the 4th century BCE, when Alexander the Great was leaving Indian soil to return to Greece, he took several varieties of this delicious fruit. Hyun-sang, the Chinese monk who came to India, mentions in his account that ancient Indian rulers planted mango trees along the roadside as a mark of prosperity. The famous poet Amir Khusrau described the mango as Nagza Tareen Meva Hindustan, the fairest fruit of Hindustan. The obsessive love of mangoes among the great Mughal emperors is legendary. The Lakhi Bagh in modern Bihar, built by Akbar the Great, had over 100,000 mango trees. At this time, we also hear of the earliest examples of the grafting of mangoes yielding interesting varieties such as Totapuri, Rataul, and the very special Kesar. Jahangir and Shah Jahan were partial to the mango, and it is at this time that the Khansamas, the royal cooks, were credited with the creation of unique preparations like the Ampanna, the green mango drink which is so common to us today, Aam ki laws, which is mango pickle, and Aam ka meetha pulao, a delicate mango dessert. The Empress Noor Jahan used mangoes and roses to create her legendary wines. So just a picture of where it is coming from, and those of you who will look at the book, you will see that the floral artists have done exquisite work with this particular fruit, in the presentation that ends the chapter. Sir, if you permit, okay, Johar uncle, if you permit, I want to bring Amita here in because I want to share with the audience the challenges that we faced while going through this book. And there were seasonal challenges. Nilayan bears, the brunt of that because, we decided on one thing for this book, that we would not get entangled in copyright issues. Because we were told very clearly by Mrs. Podar that this is going to be for an international audience. So the first decision that we had to take was that every single photograph in this book was specifically clicked for this book. So Nilayan did most of the photography, and we have some dear friends who lent from their personal collections. I would mention two people here. One is Miss Anuja Tatia, and the other is Shupratikshu Roy. But the bulk of the photography was done by Nilayan, and that's where the challenges came in, because we had to look at locations, we had to look at seasons, and we had to get the book out on time. So Amita, if you take us through that bit of with the PPT.
Just before I share some of the photographs with you, we were told initially that it shouldn't be text heavy. I think they are frightened that two history teachers would write an academic book, and that's not what WAFA India wanted. So keeping this in mind, it is very, very heavily picture-oriented, and we are delighted that with the production, full marks to the photographers and to the printers. Because when you talk about challenges, we were told by one and all, don't even dream of getting the book printed in Kolkata. They said that you'll never get the kind of quality you're looking for, or that WAFA is looking for. We were told that we should go to Singapore to get the book printed. But my daughter, who used to be in Singapore, had already moved out of Singapore, so I had no incentive to go to Singapore anymore just to get the book printed. So we decided to go local.
Not only that, Amita, I think we had jobs to hold on to.
Quite.
I mean, if we suddenly decided to up and go, the school, would, and Mrs. George and Reshma would just throw us out, I think. I mean, they're right here, and they would say, what's happening with these people?
So just to share with you, to give you a flavor of some of the kind of pictures that form a part of the book. So if you can just turn your attention to the screen on our left. So the title, I don't know if Rajesh ji is here. There he is. So could we just ask you to stand, because this cover photograph was actually shot by Mr. Rajesh Gupta of Lensocrat. And it was a first experience for us because we had no idea what it takes to shoot that one picture. It took about 4 hours, and it took, I think, at least 1,000 shots before he could get that. And something which maybe at some point of time you could chat with him and figure out, he even wanted to put an agarbatti in front, and I don't know, at that point I thought maybe there's something to do with the fragrance which would add something to the title. But whatever it is, so that title, the cover is Rajesh ji's work. We wanted to showcase some typical aspects of Kolkata and India. And one of the aspects that we thought is very, very typical to our culture are the bazaars. So we, of course, since both Priyadarshini and I stay in South Calcutta, Goriahat market was a firm favorite. And so some of the pictures you'll see, definitely the pan, then the cutting of the thor, mocha, all these things are actually shot in Goriahat market. And there, I can't tell you how excited the vendors were. They couldn't believe that here we were asking them to allow us to take pictures.
And they kept asking us, movie banayenge? Cinema jabo? So this old woman who cut the thor, and Nilayan, poor boy, dragged out of bed early in the morning by two of us. And he said, "Cinema jabo?" So I said, "Ha, apni cartoon, ami cinema apnake nichi."
So that's a typical picture. In fact, this one is actually Anuja's shot of, yes. We have a chapter on spices, and we were told when we were doing our research, we realized that masala chai is something that is so typical of Kolkata and India. So that's a stunning picture that we got of masala
And
chai.
let me just add a little bit here what makes it interesting. This masala chai photograph, Nilayan, poor boy, was giving exams. So we had to bring in another person to do that series. And from the afternoon till late evening, I was roaming the roads with this other boy, and we finally managed. We went, I'm sure all of you of South Calcutta will know Maharaja. So we went there. The boys usually are very kind to us, but that day they were in an awful mood and he kept blocking the photographs. But we managed. So we said, "Nahi, ektu tulte din," all that happened. But then what happened? When the photographs were all taken out, and Natasha, who's not here, our designer, she's getting married, in fact, she said, "Ma'am, I don't know what to do, but all the photographs are out of focus." So I was like ready to kill myself. I said that whole evening we spent trying to take that. And you know what had to be captured was the pouring of the chai, because that was typically India. And he said, "Ma'am, the photographs are all out of focus." So who to the rescue? None other than Nilayan Chattopadhyay all over again. When we told him, and you know, Nilayan had this amazing demeanor, which was so wonderful to work with. "Ma'am, ota mone hoy amar stocke ache, hoye jabe." So I was like ready to kill him. I said, "Nilayan, ami chute badalam shara shohor, and then you tell me erom bhabe, ma'am, ota bodhoy amar stocke ache, hoye jabe." So this amazing award-winning photograph came out of his stock.
Okay. So just to run you through a few more pictures. So that's a typical picture of pan in the making. Again, since we talked about legends and culture, which is associated with some of the plants, so we had to bring in the big fat Indian wedding.
But this
into
photograph had to be sourced all the way from Toronto. She's one of our students, and she got married, and I saw the picture. And I called her and I said, "Ankita, I want this picture." And she said, "Ma'am, whatever you want." So instantly the photograph arrived on my mail of this amazingly beautiful bride.
We wanted to showcase some very, very unusual rituals. One is the Tulsi Viva, which is portrayed here. Then to showcase the different parts of each plant which we spoke about. So the banana, the coconut, you'll see through the pages of the book how the fruit, the flower, the leaves, each part of the plant is used. This is the Thor picture that I talked about, shot in Goriahat Market. Likewise with the coconut. So here Pushpabitan comes into play because they said you can't just take pictures of coconut. It has to be arranged suitably. So this is how, the ladies to the rescue, they do everything so aesthetically. I don't think you can get more Indian than this. We had a number of our family and friends, their collections were raided. And my sister-in-law sitting in front was very kind to share this picture from her son's wedding. We were talking about how we had to take advantage of local events to source some of our pictures. So this was taken at the Hastoshilpo Mela. So we went there, and apart from treating ourselves to all kinds of interesting shondesh and other goodies, a lot of pictures that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to get, we managed to shoot at the Handicraft Mela. Of course, the Indian Museum was a great favorite. And amongst the favorites there, this is the a close-up of the Bharut Gallery from the railing. At this point, I have to acknowledge the immense support that we got from Kamla Poddar. She's been an integral part of this journey, and she helped us to source these pictures from the forts of Rajasthan, because we wanted to showcase how floral symbols have been a part of our art and architecture. Unfortunately, another very important person associated with the book, Preeti Sarda, is not here with us today because she's busy with a family wedding. But she arranged for our photographer to go to her husband's jute mill. And he shot these incredible pictures of the process of how jute is manufactured. And she has also made some amazing artwork using jute. Some more shots from the Hastashilpo Mela. Seasons. So, you know, we were going through this last year. Whenever the season changed, you know, we stopped appreciating the beauty of nature in any other way than, you know, saying, okay, so the mango trees are in bloom. So come on, we have to shoot the pictures of the Monjuri right now. And the floral art had to be done. So some of these pictures had to be done just in the right time so that we could get them. And of course, Durga Puja last year. I mean, our friends know that we are great pandal hoppers, but this time Durga Puja took on a different meaning because...
No, this was October 2018.
Yes.
So, you know, wherever we went, rather than appreciating the work on the pandals and the craftsmanship, we were like, you think this one will work for the book? You think that one will work for the book? Which chapter are we going to include it in? And then Nilayan was given the brief.
Poor Nilayan.
That's... jute and shola were, of course, obvious choices from the Durga Puja pandals. We shot during the flower show at the Agri-Horticulture Gardens. Of course, the Howrah Flower Market is always a favorite. And just to give you, I mean, the book is full of these amazing, amazing works of floral art. But just to give you a flavor, so this is the kind of magic that these Pushpabitan ladies can do. So this is just a sample of floral art from the jute chapter. This is shola. This is from the humble bamboo. And I think many, many things would have gone unfinished if it hadn't been for the Boishakhi, who just opened her support, her collection, and there are these absolutely mind-blowingly beautiful works of Boishakhi, including this one.
Talking of the humble pan, and because Sir had walked into that part of the Banarasi pan, this one just blew our minds because these artists, these ladies sitting here, we suddenly got this picture which was of cushions made out of different kinds of pan pata. So you have Moghai pan and you have the Banarasi pan and you have all that. So the artists are here. I think they really deserve a round of applause for their outstanding work.
And who would imagine that haldi can be transformed into this? So that's just a sampler, but the book is full. It's full of these amazing works which have been created by these ladies. Over to you, Jordan.
We'll have to round up now. I'll leave two ideas in our mind to sort of toss it all over. Have you any idea where the word puja comes from? Puja. So integral to Indian civilization. Puja combines two Dravidian words. To offer with flowers. I mean, see the amount of integration we have got in. See the amount of integration we have got in. They've, of course, tried to put a few Sanskrit meaning. It doesn't work because the best linguists have also described. So puja, pushpa, pu is a loan word from that. Okay, I'm not obsessed about that. All I'm trying to bring is the integration. The second one is I have not been able to answer, so we talk of the movement of tribes and groups over rivers and Sapta Sindhu, all in high motion and everything. But the symbol of India is placidity. Placidity to point of being stagnant, because the flower of India, lotus, arises out of still waters. Lotus arises out of still waters. So where on earth did we come to this motif of deciding upon the lotus? And this lotus became our integrator with Islamic civilization. This was the first symbol they copied. This was the first symbol that was taken over by the Buddhists, as you saw from the Bharut railing. The lotus remained in unquestionably Indian. But the lotus, if you notice, the lotus arises out of muck in stagnant waters. So we had to come to the Indo-Gangetic Valley to form what we call Indian civilization. With all the swagger of the 7, 5, Sapta Sindhu and all that, I said India was created when you crossed Nizamuddin Bridge and came over to this side. So there are these very, very integral parts of our, very, very core germane parts of our civilization. Haldi, for instance. We were talking the gifts of India. Haldi is one of them. And we have integrated Haldi, we have absorbed Haldi and intertwined with our civilization in an inseparable way. Now we get a lot of this, lot of material coming in from this WhatsApp university that talks of, and it's highly educational. WhatsApp university that you are pumped with information, you just can't refuse. And most of them are made from bogus factories, but this one is, bogus factories with a motive. Anyway, this one, the one about Haldi that's doing the circles, about Haldi being mixed in the new discovery in Western civilization is actually true. So we have Haldi, we have this thing, and the last one, I'd leave it to your mind. Why on earth did Bengalis on both sides, or the Bengal Delta, go in for jute before the jute mills came? Have you ever thought of it? Well, part shark, the leaves of the part were taken in, number one. The dried twigs were used as fuel. Those two were integral. But the fiber that came out before the factories came in was a part of our carpets and parts of our dress. To see the last jute dress, the last remnant, because everything has been finished, you have to see something called dokra, not dhokra, of West Dinajpur. I've got a coat. It's like this, natural fiber. So that explains why the people of this region went in for cultivation, because they didn't have cotton. They must remember they didn't have cotton. Cotton was always imported. But imported and then produced produced absolute wonders out of cotton. And that was our undoing, because the Brits came in here for cotton and we were finished thereafter. So we will round up this discussion. Our time is over. This has a fascinating chapter on spices as well. So we've got a broad idea what this book is all about. It's not focused personally on flowers per se, but the world of flora. And it's a different way of looking at it. So that is why I readily agreed when Kavita ji told me that come in, because it gives a lot of food for thought. And if you have anything else that comes to your mind, do send it on to me, because I'm on this continuous thinking mode. I have no option, because the continuous talking mode belongs to someone else. I didn't make any allegations.
Just before we wrap, there are a couple of points. One is I can see my dear friend Sunita Biswas sitting there. And I have to acknowledge the fact that the title Pushp Aradhana is given by her. So this beautiful, we were at our wits' end, and Sunita, will you please stand and
Let everyone see you, Sunita, because you
So-
always come to our rescue.
So we were quite at our wits' end. We thought of all kinds of titles. They wanted English, they wanted Hindi, they wanted something ritualistic, and Sunita conjured up this title.
So,
So
let
that's,
us give a big hand to these two ladies and the third one sitting there
Thank
and the
you.
photographer for
Thank you. Yes.
for giving us this gift that we will present or they will present before the World Association in a very, very explanatory, interpretive manner. It's just not a coffee table book where you have beautiful looking flowers. No, not that. It's much more than that.
And
We think-
Mrs. Podar is saying that there are books are there at the book counter, the story counter near the
Malvika?
entrance.
Acha, okay.
And
Huh?
and
She's there?
please
Mala,
join
would you
us.
no, anyway.
Pushpabitan has requested everyone present here to please
You're looking
join us for
beautiful.
a cup of tea at the Paris Cafe counter, which is
Really
near the
beautiful.
entrance. Please do stay back for a
Before
few
we
minutes.
wrap, when you make a journey, it's interesting. I'm going back to history here. I have to say this. In a journey, it's not always very happy. It's not always that there will be moments of glory only. You have your moments of utter despair, of sadness. And there's one person whom I'm really missing here today. And we lost her not just a month ago. That's Mrs. Padma Jalan.
Oh.
Because without her affection, without her contribution to this book would not have been possible. And the kind of inspiration she gave us and the kind of support she gave us, she opened her doors to us. We spent a glorious day, the entire day with her, and she conjured up things from her garden. She made all her exquisite things available to us to conjure up pictures. And there are innumerable pictures that bear her touch in this book. And we lost her not even a month ago, but as the solace that both of us have and Mrs. Podar has, is that Mrs. Podar told us she took the first dummy copy to her in Bombay, where she was suffering badly. But she saw the book in her full consciousness. So I think for that we will be forever grateful. But we do really miss her very dearly this morning, because I know that she would have been here, but I'm sure she's here with us in spirit.
Thank you very much. And we have on stage Malavika. Malavika, please feel at home. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you. I mean, she's done a great job too, getting us all together.
Thank you. And what I liked about the book is I'm not particularly informed about plants and flowers, but I recognized each one of them because these are the plants that belong to our country and are commonly seen. Many books are written about exotic plants which are hard to pronounce and harder to find in India. So this one celebrates what is native to our country and how it informs all forms of art and culture here. Thank you so much. Thank you, Johor Da.
And I have to say, this lady makes it happen and happen magically every single time. We are classmates, then she's family today. But more than that, I think we'll always remain friends. And she opened her doors heartily to us and said, how can you not have it in Kolkata? So here we are in front of you on stage.
Thank you for a very beautiful session. Second session of the day is Jahangir to Dara Shuko, the Magnificent Mughals. Should interest all the history buffs here. Parvati Sharma and Avik Chanda discuss the mighty and might have been in Mughal history in conversation with Joyanto Sengupta. Quick introductions. Parvati Sharma is an author who has written across genres. She has worked as a travel writer, editor, and journalist. She's working on her second biography at present. Avik Chanda is an author, business advisor, entrepreneur, and trainer with 2 poetry collections in Bengali and 2 books published in English to his credit. Dr. Joyendra Sengupta is a secretary and curator of the Victoria Memorial Hall and a former director of the Indian Museum. He is a historian of modern India with research interests in the interrelationship between colonialism, nationalism, and democracy and nationalism. If I may please request members of the audience to take their seats. And if Parvati could join us. Parvati's right here as well.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. So we are about to start this session, which is on Jahangir to Dara Shikoh, the magnificent Mughals, in which I have these 2 speakers, Parvati Sharma and Avik Chanda, who have both come out with fascinating books on 2 figures, Jahangir and Dara Shikoh. We are going to learn about them. But this is very interesting that both of these books have come out at a time in which we can broadly see a sort of de-Mughalization going on. We have lost Mughal Sarai, which is now Deen Dayal Upadhyay Nagar. We have lost Allahabad, which is now Prayagraj. However, in the midst of all of this, there seems to be a renewal of interest in the history of the Mughals. The Mughals are part of our being. We have grown up with the Mughals. We have read about them from junior school onwards. Many of us have memorized the sequence of the great Mughals in different ways. And we remember and memorialize them for various things, for the grand edifices they built, for their policies, for their stunning conquests, many other things. But here are so the term Great Mughals, which is a sequence from Babur to Aurangzeb, represent perhaps a set of people, 6 people, who are the most well-researched and well-documented in global history. But out of them, the authors that we have with us here today, Parvati and Avik, you have chosen 2 people that are sort of outliers in this set. Parvati, you have chosen Jahangir, who is this kind of person who is in between, who is flanked, who is bookended at either end by Akbar the Great and Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal, who built the grand edifice that Rabindranath Tagore described as a teardrop on the cheek of eternity. But you have chosen Jahangir, who was a person deemed to have been overshadowed by not only those 2 great, the 2 great Mughals, Akbar and Shah Jahan, but also was thought of as being overshadowed by his wife Nur Jahan, who sort of is thought of as having run the empire by proxy, especially during the later days. So I'm going to first open the discussion by asking each of you about your selection. Parvati, why, after you have written on Babur, you have written a wonderful children's book on Babur, but why did you choose Jahangir, who seems to us to be a transitional character? The only image that sticks to us of Jahangir, the great Mughal, is a weak monarch who is overshadowed by various people. and who is heavily into drinking and substance abuse. The only positive image which we have perhaps of his, and we will come back later to that, of the Anarkali legend, if I may say so. But first tell us, if you could say us, what is it about Jahangir that fascinated you and led you to select him for your biography?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Jonathan. It's lovely to be here with you and with you, Avik. Thank you for having me here. I think there were two reasons really for choosing Jahangir. Primarily, the first one was because having written about Babur, I had read the Babur Nama, and I had discovered what a pleasure it is and what a rare opportunity it is to be able to access somebody through their own writings. You know, and there are many histories of the Mughals written at the time, but Babur and Jahangir are the only two who wrote their own. And that kind of intimacy that you can get reading a 16th, 17th century emperor writing in their own words is really, it's a treasure, you know, and especially for a writer and especially for a novelist, it really gives you an insight into the character. And Jahangir's memoirs, the Jahangir Nama, is if anything even more readable and lucid and entertaining, you know, than Babur. So this image of a weak man is completely negated by the fact of him being a very strong, very good writer. You know, he's capable of building, describing beautifully the landscapes, the people, the cultures, the history of the Hindustan of which he is an emperor. And secondly, I think during the course of researching and then writing, it became more and more clear to me, you know, I mean, you started by talking about this de-Mughalization, but even before, I think generally when it comes to history, there's a tendency to see things in black and white. With the Mughals, also this exists, you know, so there's always been this idea of the Mughals, there's the good Mughal and the bad Mughal. So there's Akbar and then there's Aurangzeb, right? And they all come with this baggage. So when you write about Akbar, you have to have this idea of, in either case, you have certain fixed ideas that you have to either agree with or critique or, you know, engage with in some way. But in the case of Jahangir, because he has been so thoroughly ignored by history, there was no pressure like this. And it was possible then to see, you know, Jahangir not in terms of, you know, on the one hand secular, on the other hand communal, but to see him with, at a minimum, three hands. You know, so for example, this is a man who comes to power with the backing of a conservative Sunni Muslim faction in the court, which is thoroughly disgusted with all the heresies of Akbar. On the other hand, he is also a man who is described as, you know, irredeemably atheist by travelers, particularly Thomas Rowe, who says, you know, this man cannot believe. He does not have the capacity for faith. And, you know, on the third hand, this is the same man who has a deep spiritual connection with the Brahmin ascetic, you know, called Jadrup Gosen, whom he visits many, many times and has these prolonged and clearly very meaningful conversations with, you know. Or to give another example, you know, he at one point he's the product himself of a mixed marriage, you know, of an interreligious marriage. On the other hand, at one point he goes to a place called Rajour. He finds, you know, some Muslim converts who are practicing interfaith marriage, and he bans it. And on the third hand, he has his nephews converted to Christianity so that they may get Portuguese brides, you know. So he's just, and because there's no pressure on, you know, on us to see him in one way or the other, we can see him as a combination of so many different contradictory impulses, and yet making a, you know, credible whole. And I found that very fascinating in the course of writing.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Parvati. On that point, Parvati just told us about the binary between Akbar and Aurangzeb, which is a classic binary. We have read about this also in The Discovery of India by Nehru. You know, there is another binary between Aurangzeb and Dara Shikoh. And your book on Dara Shikoh is titled The Man Who Would Be King. And there is another book just out by Supriya Gandhi about Dara Shikoh, which is said, Dara Shikoh, the emperor that never was. We know who became the emperor, but it, sort of both your title and the other title convey a sort of yearning for Darashuko. This is the man who could have been king, who could have been our emperor. We almost wanted him to be our emperor. And all of this is because of the image that sticks out of Darashuko as somebody who was a mystic, a universalist, almost secular, so contrasting with Aurangzeb. So if you, and as you have also described in your epilogue, this very poignant instance of Darashuko's almost forlorn grave lying in the Humayun's tomb complex, in which you have this conversation with another traveler who is saying that, to somebody whom history has given refuge, what can Aurangzeb do? So, for a person who did not become king and who fell through the trapdoor of history, and you have written a biography on that, both of these are works of non-fiction. Tell us a bit about our selection. What is it about Darashuko that you wanted to highlight? And the kind of images that we have Darashuko, is there all that there was to this man, or is there something more of a, more of a nuanced narrative that you chose to depict for us? Please tell us about your selection.
So, Jonathan, first up, what was happening was about 2.5, 3 years ago, I had published a book with HarperCollins, and that was a business book, because I come from a corporate background. And therefore, the temptation was there to do another business book, to follow it up with something, more of the same. And what I then told myself is, let me not do that, and let me, in fact, take up something which is a complete passion project. And, being a history buff, and like so many of my generation, having grown up with the legends of the Mughals and so forth, I decided that, yes, let's write a story on the Mughals. And I was quite sure in my mind that it would have to be about a historical personage, as opposed to an historical event, such as Battle of Panipat, on which, again, we have books. And therein, when I started to do my reading, and you have great works on Shah Jahan, on Aurangzeb, spanned actually over 100 years, so going all the way back to the early 1900s, the 5-volume tomes that came out from Sir Jodhnath Sarkar,
Yeah.
and then literally 100 years later, Audrey Trushke's book, so revisiting Aurangzeb. And you have glimpses of Dara across all of these. You have the book on Shah Jahan, you have an excellent biography of Jahanara as well. And through all of these books, you get glimpses of Darashuko, but it's like this imperial chamber, and the spotlight is always on the principal character or the protagonist, and Darashuko is, so to speak, sort of waiting in the wings, right, in just outside your sphere of vision. And then I sort of told myself, why do I not bring that character into the limelight and do a book where the spotlight is only on Darashuko? So a specific reason why I wanted to do that, because, see, uncannily at the moment, Darashuko is hot and controversial for all kinds of reasons. But at that point of time, like 3 years back, the only thing of note that had happened was that Dalhousie Road in New Delhi had just been renamed Darashuko Road. But that was it. There was no other controversy, there was no symposium, there was no, setting up of a special chair in Aligarh Muslim University for research of inclusion and diversity, and Darashuko chair, etc. Nothing of that, right? So my research was telling me that 350 plus years have passed since Darashuko's death. And in all of this time, there have been only 2 monographs. Literature, a lot. Plays, a lot, both in India and in Pakistan, yes? And very good quality plays. But if you're talking about biography, serious biography, non-fiction, there were only 2. There was one which is written by Kolikaranjan Kanungo, like mid-1930s, and then 1953, Bishwabharati publication of Bikramjit Hazrat. And I said, all right, so maybe now it is the time, and it's uncanny that Shupriya's books also come out around exactly the same time. So I told myself, look, this is the time to revisit Darashuko and look at his life again in maybe in modern terms, and to try and bring him to life. So that was my project. Jayantata, if I may, I'll make
Yes, please.
one more observation, and that's what you started off with, the demobilization.
Yes.
So Professor Dipesh Chakraborty, right? He's amongst one of his very many seminal works and articles is one where he talks about post-coloniality and
The
the
artifice of history.
yeah. So
Who
how are
speaks
we
of our past?
how are we interpreting
Yes.
India's past? Who is talking about India's past, right? And his main thesis, this is like 10, 12 years back that he published his work, is that for the longest time, including Jodhanath Sarkar, Ramachandra Mojumdar, and all the other historians of the early part of the 20th century, the narrative was still very much through the prism of the Europeans, through the rulers, right? And how after independence, the post-colonial push, you see, let's say through the AMU revolution, if you will, right? Iqtidar Alam Khan, Athar Ali, Irfan Habib Saab, right? Shireen Mosvi. So all of them are basically pushing against that, and this is a new narrative,
Yes.
which is the anti-colonial narrative. And now what we are seeing is the anti-colonial narrative. So we'll probably come full circle, or maybe it's not a full circle, it's just some bizarre arc that goes nowhere.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Avik. I just want to come back to Parvati and her book on Jahangir. So, as you so aptly say, it's only Babur and Jahangir who write their autobiographies. And Jahangir is somebody who would seem to be, according to conventional wisdom, not a person whom you would expect to write a memoir. Please tell us about the flavor that comes out of his memoir. You know, the kind of writing an autobiography or a memoir is something which needs a lot of determination, a lot of dedication, and you wouldn't normally identify Jahangir as a person likely to do that. So when you read his memoirs, what kind of a person, what kind of a self-writing, self-image that comes out? Is he self-indulgent, neutral, self-critical, what? And you are looking at the world through his eyes, right? So please tell us about somebody who has written both fiction and non-fiction. Read us about the flavor of reading his memoirs and getting a sense of both the character and the age that he was looking at.
Well, I mean, I could just talk endlessly about his memoirs. I enjoyed them so much. I think one thing is you get from it the clear sense that he is a very skillful writer because he gets you on his side. You are inclined to believe him. You are inclined to be sympathetic towards him, even when he does very unsympathetic things. For example, within the first few pages, he's talking about how he had Abul Fazl, who was Akbar's, very, very loyal courtier and his biographer, murdered. He says that Abul Fazl was always saying snide things, making snide remarks about me, and so I called I sent a message to Bir Singh Bundela and said, can you please have this man taken care of? And indeed he waylaid him and had his head cut off his head. And it's cold-blooded murder, right? But he writes it so frankly. He's just so honest about it that you have to admire just at least the fact that he's admitting it. He's not trying to hide it. And secondly, I think once you start reading more deeply, then it's also perhaps it gives you an impression of the age, right? Because in the 17th century, a would-be emperor ordering somebody who is in the way of the throne, having him killed, is not a mark of evil or of murderous tendency, but a mark of strength. Yes. He is ensuring his path to the throne, and that is his duty as a prince. Yes. So there are these kind of contradictions that emerge in the writing. You also see him, you see the kind of discipline that he had, because again he writes very frankly about his drinking, and in some very entertaining passages he talks about how he used to drink 20 goblets of double distilled liquor in a day, 14 during the day and the remaining after dark. And sorry.
Just a small digression is that I work a little bit on the history of food, and I have read in the works of the great food historian K.T. Acharya that Jahangir was, he was this great drinker, 20 glasses of wine per day at least, but he ordered everything in the Mughal kitchen to be to be cooked with Ganges water.
Yes, yes, and Akbar also. I think Akbar is the one who starts it. They only drank water from the Ganga and cooked in it.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. So he drank these 20 goblets a day, and then eventually he says his hands used to shake so much he couldn't even hold the glass himself. Somebody else would have to pour the liquor down his throat. And then he realizes that he needs perhaps to consult a doctor on this subject. And the doctor arrives, and the doctor says to him, "If you continue like this, you'll be dead in 6 months." And then, you see that this man has a will to survive, because two of his brothers die of drink. They can't control it. He brings it down through this very strict regimen of, diluting his liquor with wine, substituting the daytime drinking with opium, and, the various sort of measures like this that that allow him to in fact survive and then to rule for 22 years, which is no mean feat. So again, you see this combination of a sort of seemingly dissolute personality that also has a strong sense of discipline, And thirdly, what you see perhaps in the Jahangirnama is this obsessive desire to document, which is I think he's not alone in this. The Babur onwards, the Mughals are writing down everything that they observe. So he will document everything from the width of this cave in which Jadrup Gosain meditates, to the date on which the last mango of the season is given to him, to the size of a particularly large peach, to the number of cherries that he plucks from a tree, and also he writes these beautiful passages on the melodies of Tansen and the metaphors of Hindustani poetry and of the landscapes. He travels widely across India. The landscapes of Mandu, the landscape of Gujarat, various experiments that he conducts, and even in and then he also orders many paintings to be made to bolster his own description. So in that sense, the book itself, after having read it, I recommend it to everybody because it's very accessible and it really presents the picture of a curious man in both senses of the word. He was an oddball, but he was also a man of prodigious curiosity, and that makes him very.
Of course.
something.
Just on that theme of food, since you have also written on Babur, and Baburnama has this famous passage in which Babur is lamenting on the absence of good fruits and flowers and good-looking women in Hindustan. So he is sort of pining for the peaches, the apricots, the melons that he had left behind in Kabul. The only thing that passes muster for now is the mango. So that's Babur. But Jahangir, when he travels to Kabul, and he is enjoying, and he's enjoying the fruits of trees planted once by Babur and all that. But he says that all of this is good, melon is good, but nothing compares to the Hindustani mango. That's a transition of, and would you call that a transition towards the Mughals becoming completely Indian, as it were?
To me, it was a very striking moment. You can't help but be struck by it, because there's Babur reduced to tears when a consignment of melons comes to him from Kabul. He says, mango is okay, bearable, but what I will not do for a melon. And there's Jahangir, this is 2 generations later, goes to Kabul, eats all these apricots, peaches, and he says, all very well, but what, mango is the king of fruits. And so it's the taste of home, isn't it? And by that time, the home is
India.
Hindustan.
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
yeah.
What a wonderful episode. Avik, again, going back to Dara Shikoh and the point about Dara Shikoh, unlike Jahangir, is this great what if kind of person. What if he would have gone on to become the king or the emperor? And so it's one of the great counterfactuals of history that we sort of fondly toy with. And the image that sticks out of Dara Shikoh to us is this mystic who is a superior being, who confers with religious men from different religions, who knew Sanskrit, who translated these texts into Persian, translated the Upanishads, Sar-e-Akbar, of which we have a manuscript copy in the Victoria Memorial, also of the Majma'ul Bahrain, his treatise on comparative religions. So he comes across as a man who is far advanced from his age. And so do you think that this is a true representation of the man? He was, what would be your take on this what if, on this counterfactual, that would he have, if he had gone on to become the king, then would we have had so much communal strife, or would we have had even colonial rule? What would be your take on that?
So Jantada, first up, is that the truth? Yes. Is that the whole truth about him? No.
Of course not.
Right? So let's first talk about the truth in a slightly deeper fashion. The common perception is that in the entire Mughal dynasty, whenever you're talking about, of course, secularism is a modern word, but syncretism, it's essentially Akbar with Din Elahi and Suli Kul, and then there's nothing. There's a little flickering of a diya called Dara Shikoh, and when that goes down, this is, this sheer slide to damnation, to perdition, right? And I'm going to stray into Parvati territory here, but that's not true, because the Majlisi Jahangiri shows us that when Jahangir was Salim, he was a rebel, a Baghi, then everything that the emperor, his father, did was wrong. But when he becomes the Shahanshah himself, he has a similar Ibadat Khana, and he has these similar religious discourses. So it's not as if there's Akbar and there's a little bit of Dara and there's nothing else, right? So, so definitely there is a continuity in terms of being pluralistic, in terms of being not just secular in a modern sense, but just being open-minded, being curious. And what Francois Bernier says about Dara is kind of similar to what's been said about Jahangir. Not that he could not have faith, not that part, but he was almost like a vessel, and you could pour the water in, right, in any which way. So, and Francois Bernier goes on to say that with a Jesuit, he was a Jesuit. With a Hindu yogi, he was a Hindu yogi. With a Sufi, he was a Sufi, right? So he had this eternal yearning for spiritual truth. And I'll draw another parallel with Jahangir, if I may. So Jahangir was, in those days, right, a naturalist, a scientist, a man with deeply analytical ability towards all that was in the external world around him. In a similar fashion, Dara was probably an explorer, a naturalist of the soul. You see? So he does this much lesser extent than Jahangir, but there are his treatises, the Risala-i Haqnuma, and you have the Sir-e-Akbar, you have the Majma' al-Bahrain, you have the Yoga Vashisht, which some of his scholars in his pay, they translated from the original Sanskrit into Persian, but he writes the foreword, and then you get a glimpse, because this is Dara Shikoh writing firsthand, so you get a glimpse of the man and his ethos. So he says, I always thirsted for divine union with the Almighty, for Tawheed. And having gone through the Quran and the Hadith, having gone through the book of Psalms and the book of Moses and the books of the Christians, I eventually turned my attention to the religion, to the ancient religion of Hindustan. And that is where he has, this is a completely epiphanic, moment for him when he discovers, for instance, and that's a completely subjective discovery, which the ulema and anybody orthodox were completely opposed to, is that there's a surah in the Quran which talks about a hidden book, an ancient Quran, which is like the source of all scriptures. And he finds that in the Upanishads. And then he says, I absolutely have to translate this. This is my life's work. Similarly, he would have these completely surreal but very moving dreams. So Ramchandra and Yoga Vashisht would appear to him in his dreams, and then he would wake up and say, I must get the Yoga Vashisht translated. Right? So that's only one aspect of Dara Shikoh's character. The other aspect of his character, which is far less well known and possibly far less publicized for many reasons, is that while he had this deep, generosity, this prodigious generosity of spirit and warm-heartedness, and he was definitely a very dutiful and obedient son, a dutiful, husband and a father, he was incredibly cold, he was arrogant, he was aloof towards the mass of courtiers across denominations. So on the one hand, he would propound himself as the friend and the supporter and the champion of the Hindus, and he would write to the Rajput Rajas. But when it came to the field of battle, for example, the aborted or doomed campaign of Kandahar, it was the same man who alienated Jaswant Singh. It was the same man who, riled Sarup Singh and Rajub Singh and everybody else. So the alienation wasn't just of Sadullah Khan, which is a kind of similar rivalry like that of Abul Fazl and Jahangir, because Sadullah Khan was the Wazir-e-Azam, the prime minister, old, seasoned, poised, and Dara Shikoh was opposed to him. So it's not just that, but even the Hindu Rajas he had opposed, which explains that right at the end, not the Battle of Samugar, but the final battle that he fights and loses just off Ajmer and on the passes of Derai, he doesn't have a single Rajput Raja on his side. By that time, Raja Jaswant Singh, with 20,000 Sawars at the ready, who could have come to Dara Shikoh's rescue, has abstained, has stayed away from the battle, whereas Rajrup Singh and Jai Singh are ferociously on the side of Aurangzeb fighting against Dara Shikoh, right? So in terms of what would have happened had he come to the throne? So, okay, in terms of fiscal policy, I dare say, Professor Stiglitz might agree that when you have lower incidence of tax and a flatter incidence of tax, the general populace isn't unhappy. So, no, but on a serious note, forget about the jizya, which was not there, which was reintroduced by Aurangzeb once he becomes Emperor Alamgir. But before that, during Shah Jahan's time, there was a pilgrim tax. So let's say you were in Delhi and you were going to Banaras to offer pilgrimage, right? So instead of the fast tag that you have now, you would have to have, there would be a toll gate, and you would have to pay pilgrimage tax because you are a Hindu who is going for the purpose of pilgrimage, like tawaf, right? So you have to pay that. And Jahanara, Dara Shikoh's daughter, Dara Shikoh's sister, together with the brother Dara Shikoh, they intercede with Shah Jahan, and the pilgrimage tax is waived. So there would be, purely from the perspective of economic policy or fiscal policy, there would not be extremely harsh or draconian measures, that's for sure. Right. But Dara Shikoh was no military commander, he was no military ruler. And whenever this came up, so during the Kandahar campaign, during the Battle of Samugar, and finally the tragic Battle of Derai, he was a failure on the field of battle. And at that point in time, you had to be a military commander, a ruler. It was not enough to be a statesman. Today, it is not important to be a military commander, to be a warlord, making excuses for Trump. But it's not essential to be a ruler in a democratic society. But at that point of time, it definitely was. Over and above that, if you take people like Humayun, who were also under the great sway of astrologers and mystics of all denominations, so was Dara Shikoh. So there were like definite failings in his character, which would have made it difficult for him to sustain himself over a long reign, even had he succeeded to the throne.
Of course. Thank you so much. I'm sure the audience have many questions, but before throwing it open, I have a quick question as a student of history to ask of you. I have read history and have taught it for some time, but here I have just read two wonderful books of history by two people. Parvati read English literature first and then history, and you are perhaps the historian who never was. You are in the corporate world. But these works, mind you, are works of non-fiction. They are solidly based on archives. You have read everything that is, written on all of this. How do you think? And I would just like to both of you to have quick comments on the craft of this, in which you are using the archives and also your creative imagination as authors of fiction also, to write books of history which gives us a sense of the age. The past is not on candid camera. We have not seen it happen. But you give us a sense of the age and the people who crowd those ages by, in a sense, using your imagination to go beyond the limits of the archive, as it were. And that perhaps makes a greater contribution to the craft of history and to the popularization of history than conventional historians do. And if you could give us quick comments on how did you do that? And then we will throw this open.
Sure. I think, in detail is always key, both in any kind of writing. Detail can really bring a moment alive. And so perhaps maybe I can give one example was, it's clear just from the most cursory knowledge of history that Akbar was a far greater emperor than his son Jahangir, that he achieved far more in his life than Jahangir did, and Jahangir really was basking in the glories that he inherited. And it's not difficult to see that he would have been a very impressive man. And there is historical record to show that Akbar was also a man of quick temper. He was very charismatic. He could be very charming, but he also had a temper. And there is a little line in the Jahangir Nama when Jahangir is talking about his father, and he always talks about him in the most respectful, greatly affectionate terms. And he says, he was this very impressive figure. He had the body of a lion. He had this mole on his nose that was very very beautiful. And he says he had a very loud voice. And to me, it struck, and I suppose this would be a liberty I took as a sort of from my experience of writing fiction, is that if this man is in his 30s writing a memoir and still remembers the loudness of his father's voice, perhaps as a child he remembers being a little intimidated by it. This really impressive, high achieving emperor. Whose voice is booming through the zenana and perhaps scaring his little sons a little bit. So that imagination I had, in my head, and I tried not to let it run away with me too much, but it did inform how I wrote about their relationship, which I thought was a very affecting relationship, because this is a prince who will never be able to match his father's expectations, and yet he is also a prince who is born as a result of great prayers, that famous story of Salim Chishti, and how much Akbar wanted a son and how much he wanted an heir, and this boon that was granted him, and how thrilled he was when Jahangir was born, and eventually how disappointed. So I guess maybe that's just one example, but detail was always the key.
Of course. Thank you. Avik.
So Jantada, in writing Dara Shikho, I did something that was bravado to the point of being foolhardy, and I've promised myself never to do that again, because although I had access to all of the rich scholarship that's been there on the Mughals for the last 100 years, so all the way from Jodhanath Sarkar to Otto Trushkin, Sanjay Subramaniam, Zafar Alam, and others, what I could have done is right at the outset, reach out to the experts, take their guidance, and kind of morph the text around that and have a process of feedback, etc. And I did nothing of that sort. I just wanted to...
Good that you didn't.
I wanted to kind of remain in the flow. And I said, I had a discussion with my editor, Rahul Soni, and also Priya Doraswamy, actually the agent whom we both work with. And both of them said, look, you can do it both ways, as non-fiction, which is far more academic, and as non-fiction, which is far more engaging and accessible. And they advised me, because you've written fiction before, similar to Parvati, why don't you, the treatment, the presentation of it, why can't it be in a novelistic style, while adhering to historical authenticity all through? And that's what I went for.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you. And I gather that for their next projects, Parvati is going one generation up. And Ovik, who has tried his hands, apart from management consulting, he has tried his hands at poetry, at history, and then now is turning into a playwright for your next project. So if you could just tell us briefly about your next projects, and then we'll throw up the floor to the audience.
Well, as you say, I'm going back a generation, so I'm doing Akbar now,
Right.
and very different man from Jahangir. Jahangir was intimidated. I am a little intimidated myself, just tackling him. And often, I think we read historians writing about Akbar. Most of them seem to have been intimidated by him. He's so, he's just so overwhelming. But he's a challenge, and I'm looking forward to. I'm keeping my fingers crossed for that book.
Wonderful. Avik?
So yes, in terms of the play, I've written a very small, like 4-scene play based on the Dara Shikoh book, and to my great fortune, Podatik have agreed to put it on production.
Congratulations. Fantastic.
So they'll probably do a Hindustani version of it first, and,
Sure.
and then we'll see. And in terms of a book, I do definitely want to do a historical biography again soon, and we'll see. I'll come to you for advice.
Okay. So watch this space in the future. I'm sure you must have many questions. We have some time for questions. So if you could just please identify yourself briefly and please keep the questions short and pointed. Yes, please. There should be some cordless. Okay, we'll get back to you.
Hello. Yeah, my name is Shudeepa Bose. Thank you, both of you, for the wonderful insights and the explanations that you've done about your fascinations with the characters and the why, what led you to it. Now, both Parvati and Avik, if the two of you were to sit together and compare notes about your two protagonists, what would you be saying to each other? Something, any similarities, any continuum that you see, or lots of dissimilarities? Maybe one similarity, one dissimilarity.
I would definitely find a similarity not between Jahangir and Dara, but between Jahangir's son and Dara. Jahangir's son Khusro was another of these sort of lost characters in history. Almost made it. Might have, God knows what would have happened if he had, because Akbar wanted him and many people. He had a very strong backing in the Mughal court to be the next emperor, because nobody trusted this Jahangir with his 20 goblets and all that to actually rule properly. But Jahangir managed, and then Khusro was kept prisoner for almost the entire duration of Jahangir's reign. Right at the end, he met a very tragic fate. He was handed over to Shah Jahan, his own brother, who had him killed. But he's a kind of a sort of precursor to Dara in a sense. This sort of man who might have been.
Another sort of dissimilarity, which is sort of contrary to the popular perception of Jahangir as this completely ineffectual rake, this dissolute man, is I think Jahangir in his own way was a fairly bright person. I mean, in his moments of lucidity, he would talk, and again, this is from the Jahangir Naman, the Tuzuki Jahangiri, he would talk of consolidating his base at the Akbari fort in Ajmer and use that to make further inroads into Rajasthan, and sending his son Khurram to finally once and for all subjugate Mewar and bring the Mewar prince to, as a hostage, as almost as a prisoner to the Mughal court. It's all Jahangir, right? And there's this line which stuck in my mind, and he says, everything depends on timing. And I was like, my God, I mean, that could be, from a Harvard Business Review or a Gartner or a Forrester journal in today's days, because he's talking about timing for any kind of a strategy that you're talking about. Dara Shikoh is a different constellation from that. I mean, he would definitely plan, but he would plan projects where he would take the principal Upanishads and he would assemble Brahmins from Benares one time during the late 1650s when he did not accompany his father, Shah Jahan. When on his excursion out of Delhi, he says, I have very important work to do. And this is the important work. So their strategies and their planning were like in completely different,
My name is Sri Joydeep, and thank you for this enlightening discussion on the Mughal Empire. I have a specific question on the, because specifically on this Mughal period, if you see Akbar period, there was an origin of the Indian classical music. And mostly you have Tanshen, and then you have his Guru Haridas, and then afterwards you have Tanshen converted into Muslim. And so how do you see, I mean, what was their influence? Is the ruler bringing a big influence on origination of the classical music, or is it just, how do you see it? What is your take on it?
That will be in Parvati's next book, not this one. But
yeah, no, so I can't really, I haven't studied sort of the music or classical music origins in any depth, so I can't really answer the question that you asked. I can only tell you one little story that I enjoyed, which is again from the Jahangirnama about the death of Salim Chishti. And it seems when Salim Chishti died, on his deathbed, the last thing he asked for was for Tansen to come and sing to him. And I thought that was quite, that was really a kind of metaphor for the Mughal court in Akbar's time. The dying Sufi saint who asks for Tansen to come and sing to him on his deathbed.
Thank you for a very fascinating conversation. As you were talking about speculation on the course of history dependent on the characters, I couldn't help but think about the man who became the king following, and that's Aurangzeb. And I don't know how the actual facts, as opposed to whether it's a more romantic, hyped-up tale, but about the prince when he goes to Burhanpur and meets Hirabai. And that's the time when he actually was apparently tempted to drink alcohol, and he was a proficient veena player. And after that, allegedly following Hirabai's death, he kind of becomes a much more coarsened character. So had Hirabai existed for longer, would we have seen a different Aurangzeb and the course of history?
That would be in the realm of pure speculation. It's similar to, again, had Dara Shikoh become emperor, what would have happened? For any kind of speculation to be remotely sensible, it has to be within the ambit of academic formulation, right? One way of addressing it is not through the sphere of history at all, but political economy. So, political economists have these mathematical models and formulations, and there is, interestingly, a work that's there in the American Economic Review, which talks about the fact that if you have a ruler who has a council of advisors, right? Is it likely that it's going to be less unilateral? Is it likely the decisions will be less didactic, and therefore is it much more likely that the economy as a whole is going to be in a superior level of utility, like a parity to superior state? So, if Aurangzeb had become a different kind of a ruler, or had become like Dara would have been, then yes, possibly.
Now, I have been seeing these frantic hand gestures conveying to me that we can continue this discussion for some time more, because next speaker hasn't yet arrived. But Parvati has a flight to catch. She is on her way to the Jaipur Literary Festival. So maybe, do you have any more time left, or would you like? We can continue this discussion. Avik can take your questions and.
Yes. And
okay.
I will have to apologetically leave. I'm very sorry to have to do this, but it was a wonderful session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Parvati. Thank you for
and
your
thank you, Avik.
wonderful book on Jahangir. But we do you have another couple of minutes? Okay, yeah. So thank you so much, Parvati, and have a great sessions in Jaipur Literary Festival. And we look forward to another session on your book on Akbar.
Absolutely. I know. Please keep your fingers crossed for me.
Absolutely, inshallah. Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Take care. We'll be in touch.
Yes, we have a question here. Yeah, just pass the cordless mic to her. Yeah.
Yes, I can.
No, I think the other people have to hear it.
I have a quick question. It was actually to both the authors, but you can answer me. I'm just curious that despite all this historical material which was available to you, why did you choose the format of historical non-fiction or historical biography instead of writing a historical novel, so to say?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, when I was just starting the project, I did ponder this very question because I'd written a novel before and I was thinking, look, there is enough material for it to be credible and still become pure fiction, where you could sort of go into many more sort of imaginings and further dramatizations of what actually occurred. And then it sort of came to me, it dawned on me that doing so would actually dilute the main message maybe that I was trying to bring forward to Darashikoh, and which is particularly germane in today's narrative, right? As Parvati said, you have the paradigm of the good Mughal and the bad Mughal, the good Muslim and the bad Muslim, and anachronistically, the good Indian, Darashikoh being touted as the emblem of Indianness, anachronism by 2.5 centuries, and the bad Indian, Aurangzeb. And what I've tried to do in my narrative is show through various instances, through various incidents, that there were various shades of failings and attribute skills in both Darashikoh as well as Aurangzeb. And I think that kind of a dispassionate discussion may have been a little difficult in a novel format.
Right, we have 2 hands up on the back. At the back. Cordless mics, please, at the back. Is anybody there with cordless mics to pass on? At the hands raised at the back. Please, at the back. Somebody should stand here with the cordless mic so that they can pass them on to those with questions at the back. We'll get back to you. Yeah. Please.
Thank you. I would like to understand a little more about the connections between the Rajput kings and the Mughals. You spoke about how it was different with Aurangzeb and Darashikoh. Can you please explain how exactly that was and why it was that maybe the Rajput kings sided with Aurangzeb, who was much more a different kind of a ruler than Darashikoh? How was the connections? What kind of stuff was there? Maybe you could elaborate that a bit more.
Sure. Well, Parvati would have been the ideal person to answer the first part of that question, because you have to look at the relationship across 5 or 6 generations. So starting with Babur. So when Babur comes, he comes in as an invader. He does not come in as a Shahanshah or a Jahanpana, right? Because he's entering enemy territory. So every single battle that he fights against the Rajputs, in particular Rana Sanga, is a complete engagement of aggression and nothing else. So Humayun is a lesser military general. So he had enough problems trying to deal with factions within his own sort of entourage, particularly his brother Kamran Mirza, and then the rise of the Afghans under Sher Suri to really bother too much about the Rajputs. When it comes to Akbar, that is where you see the grand transition, right? Because, and again, this is more Parvati territory than mine. Jantodapni, please keep me honest. Is that Akbar has this then dual policy. Wherever his first gambit, if you will, is through diplomacy, is through tact. And that is where he wins over Raja Man Singh as one archetype. At the other end of the spectrum is Maharana Pratap, who cannot be wooed over through diplomacy. But even then, he does not appear on the field of battle himself at Haldigati. It is his intermediate, and he could have sent out his army under a Mughal or a Muslim general. But it was actually Raja Man Singh. That's the curious irony of it, right? And this cannot be anything but deliberate on Akbar's part, that he assigns Raja Man Singh to go and attack Mewar, right? And then you have the famous battle of Haldigati. When you go post-Akbar, with the except around Jahangir's time and well into Shah Jahan's time, the only thorn in their flesh was Mewar. All the other Rajput Rajas had become effectively their vassals, and as a result of that, they were rewarded. So you have this concept of the Jagir. So if my father gets a Jagir, it lasts till his lifetime, and I don't inherit it, unfortunately. Okay, but you have this concept of a Watan Jagir, where you have a Suba or a province or this princely state, and the concept of the Watan Jagir is so long as you prove your continued support and loyalty to the Mughal regime, to the monarchs, that is in succession. So your sons and their progeny can inherit the entire Watan or that territory, right? So that comes into play. That comes into focus. So it's a policy of assimilation. It's a policy of befriending the Rajputs, of co-opting the brave Rajput Sawars into the rank and file of the Mughal army, of the Shahi Fauj, and making sure that commanders of merit were promoted, were given charge of armies, where even there would be cases where you would have a Rajput commander going out to battle against the enemy, and there are cohorts, there are squadrons or companies of Muslim fighters under his charge. And that continues all the way till Shah Jahan, right? And beyond. Although there are interludes where Mewar continues to be a problem. When we come to Aurangzeb, and this is the great, I think, insight, one of the eye-openers for me, is that Aurangzeb, before he becomes the Emperor Alamgir, is an extremely shrewd, astute diplomat, politician. Definitely, Krishnan Srinivasan sir would have had a lot to discuss with him around that time, because great amount of tact and diplomacy is used, not brute force, to win over the Rajput rulers one by one. So you have the case of Rajrup Singh, you have the case of Jai Singh, and also the case of Jaswant Singh, who, after losing out to Aurangzeb, Aurangzeb does not go to Jodhpur after him. Aurangzeb does not go all out to, kill all the Sawars and raze Jodhpur to the ground. Instead, through Jai Singh, he sends messages to Jaswant Singh that, come over to our side, and we will give you more Jagirs, we will give you more khilat, we will give you more honors and more promotions that you could have ever imagined. It's a very different policy once he becomes Emperor Alamgir and then becomes far more didactic.
Yeah, sure, yeah. I think we probably have, yes? No. I think this was a perfect answer, I guess. Yes, I think we can have one more question, probably, or more. Do we have one more? Yes. So this will be the last question, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Mrinalini. My question to you is, yesterday we had Dr. Shashi Tharoor here. In his book, The Era of Darkness, he's spoken a lot about how whatever the British looted from India, they repatriated most of it, right? There was no, as a proportion of what they looted, what was invested in the country was a minuscule proportion. How would you say that the Mughals compared in that respect? How much would you say that applied to the Mughals?
Right, so as that was one part of what Shashi Tharoor said, right? He did talk about the fact that there was a redistribution of the wealth that was appropriated from the land. He did not say it was an equitable redistribution. Big economic difference, right? And what Shashi Tharoor said, that there were edifices, there were mosques, there were buildings, there were mausoleums, etc., which meant that the tax money, the revenue that was earned, a lot of that went back into work that provided employment and sort of sustained or buoyed the, if I may sort of extend Shashi Tharoor's argument, buoyed the economy to a large extent, right? But that is one part of the question. The second part of the question is, was it an equitable distribution? Particularly when you get into the latter stage of the Mughal regime, particularly when Aurangzeb, Alamgir, leaves Delhi and campaigns for long decades in the Deccan, there is tremendous amount of corruption that's been documented there, and it's rife with corruption, it's rife with nepotism, it's rife with extortion money. So that is definitely towards the latter part, from the late 16, maybe 70s, 80s onwards. That slide has already started. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. One of the, I think the critical difference between the Mughals and the British were that the Mughals, I mean, there was a lot of redistribution of wealth under Mughal rule. And, towards the end of Aurangzeb's reign, there is all of these revolts by the Sikhs, the Marathas, the Rajputs, the Rohilla Afghans, everybody, and these Mughal subas are becoming almost semi-autonomous, independent. And that also leads to a huge regionalization, the shifting of the dynamics of Indian history from the center in Delhi to the regions like Awadh or Hyderabad or Bengal, Murshidabad. So unlike the British, there is a lot of churning within Mughal India with a redistribution of wealth, but it's all eventually a movement of capital and resources within the Indian subcontinent. That crucially marks out the Mughal system from something like the Plassey plunder or the drain of wealth under colonial rule. I think we had some very interesting questions, and again, so we will end our discussion here. And so, thank you so much, Avik Chanda, for your wonderful book on Dara Shikoh, which I, as a student of history, learned a lot from. And please buy this book and read it, and then engage with, because this is a wonderful, this conveys the flavor of the age and this fascinating person whom we are sort of fond of, but in very stereotypical terms. You have brought across to us a real flavor of the man and his age as is really were. So thank you very much, Avik, for writing this book, and we look forward to another historical biography of another person who will remain unnamed for now. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.